debate in 2012. Okay. Approximately 67 million people tuned in on October 3rd, 2012 to watch the first of 3 presidential debates between incumbent President Barack Obama and former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. And just to give you some context to this, coming out of the Democratic National Convention, Obama had about a 3-point bounce in the polls. And many people felt that if he put in a pretty commanding debate performance in that initial debate, that he would build and perhaps extend his lead over Romney, and that perhaps it would have been more difficult for Romney to catch up, given the short time period between October and, of course, the election in the first part of November, giving him a chance to extend his lead. The debate, though, as for those of you that remember this, really gave Romney a second chance. One reporter called it Romney's reprieve because he put in such an outstanding, dominating performance that he made Obama look as though he was confused, lackadaisical, and certainly didn't have a good understanding of the issues. A CNN poll that was conducted immediately after the debate found close to 67% of uncommitted voters felt that Romney had won the debate. And in a CBS poll that looked at positivity and negativity, about 59% of those polled said that they had a more positive view of Romney after that debate compared to 13% for Obama. So a lot of the post-debate coverage on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS all focused on a lot of the stylistic problems that Obama had in the debate. And they talked about, again, the performance that Romney put in, his ability to look at Obama directly, to look into the camera and explain his points as well as he did. And all of that is very informative for us to know. We know, though, that in political campaign coverage, most of the time the media focuses primarily on stylistic issues. And they ignore a lot of the substantive components that went into the debate. In other words, what are these candidates actually talking about? Are they making good, logical arguments, and are they responding to arguments that the other one is advancing? So what we took a look at was the substance of the debate. We wanted to look underneath the hood to get beyond just some of the stylistic analysis that we saw represented on television, to actually see what kinds of arguments were being developed in this debate and in what way, shape, or form those could have influenced perceptions of Obama's performance or Mitt Romney's performance. So the main purpose of this, which is part of a larger study that examines the functional features of debate itself, political debate, was to highlight the types of persuasive value appeals that candidates used in this particular debate. And we developed 2 research questions. The first one was more of a descriptive question, looking at what types of value appeals were given the most emphasis in the debate itself. And the second is more of sort of a hypothetical, speculative question, which was what were the rhetorical implications of these appeals in terms of the public's perception of Romney winning and Obama losing. The framework that we used for this study was developed by Steele and Redding in 1962. And it works something like this. It has been argued that our culture has persuasive leverage. And what that means is that our culture, as you know, for those of you that have studied culture and intercultural communication, our culture is made up of a worldview. And within that worldview, we have a number of myths, narratives, values, beliefs, and attitudes that are represented by the dominant culture. And these views tend to get perpetuated over and over and over again in much of just the reality of day-to-day living. Steele and Redding argued, and they extended some work that was done by Aristotle on the enthymeme. And an enthymeme is a truncated syllogism. As you know, in traditional Aristotelian logic, a syllogism consists of 3 parts. You have a major premise, minor premise, and a conclusion. What Steele and Redding argued is that oftentimes a rhetorician will ignore one of the 2 premises. And in doing so, they assume it to be true. And as applied to political rhetoric, they argued that sometimes politicians will make arguments in which they presume the actuality of a particular premise statement. So, for example, in dominant U.S. mainstream culture, we value individualism. So I might make an argument where I assume that all of you share this notion of individualism being a value that ought to be upheld. So I make an argument about individual rights. Okay, again, presuming that all of you agree with me that individualism is something that's important and should be valued. Well, what they argued is that this sort of taken for granted value system that's operating in the backdrop of a persuasive environment is not only unexpressed, but it's also uncontested. And so when you rhetorically analyze a persuasive message, you can actually look for signifiers that will in some way illuminate the underpinnings of the conceptual argument. So in other words, what unstated premises are being made in the argument, and to look for those, we look at dominant mainstream value structures. Okay. These things form a latent normative proposition, if you will. And it's a good way for voters. Some work was done by Gordon and Miller a few years ago looking at presidential debates and value arguments, and they argue that values play a huge role in a couple of things. For voters, number one, it tells us where people stand on the issues, and it's more of an ideological knowledge, if you will. I can sort of get a sense of where you are, you know, instead of you saying, you know, I'm liberal or progressive and I'm conservative, we can just sort of figure out where you are. We can extrapolate from your value arguments where you are on that spectrum. And the second thing is that it helps voters fill in the blanks. So even on issues that aren't necessarily brought up in the campaign, issues that aren't necessarily discussed in a presidential debate, I can extrapolate from those values where you might stand on other issues. So there's a predictive component to it. So for example, if I know that this is where you stand on this issue, you probably will stand this way on that issue, even though again it's been unexpressed. So there's some normative knowledge that's gained from it. Well, for those of you that are familiar with Walter Fisher's narrative theory, Fisher talks about something called narrative fidelity, which is that a narrative oftentimes will ring true to an audience. And that's where its persuasive appeal comes from. And that's another way of describing this, is that when a politician makes an argument or a candidate makes an argument, certain components of it will just ring true to the audience. So if I make an argument, a policy argument that's grounded in the culture's dominant value system, greater the opportunity there that will ring true for that group. Okay, so I can then use it as part of my overall campaign narrative to try to operate off of those base assumptions that we all share. So if you're a practitioner, what this means is that it would be wise for a political candidate to make arguments that invoke or appeal to the majority group's preferred set of values, as those are presumed to be the standards by which they will judge the nature of their reality. So the method that we use, let me first tell you a little bit about the debate itself for those of you that perhaps didn't see it or can't recall it. The debate was hosted at the University of Denver. It consisted of several different topical segments. As you know, for those of you who study political debates, you know that there's a lot of discussion about how the format affects what goes on. In this particular one, Jim Lara from PBS hosted it. He's hosted most televised presidential debates. They had 6 topical segments, 90-minute debate total. They had to eliminate the last one because they ran out of time. Here were the topics that were discussed. They had 3 segments on the economy, 1 segment on health care, 1 segment on the role of government, and then the final one, which was eliminated, was on the act of governing itself, okay, which is sort of a leadership question. Each segment, like I said, was 15 minutes long, and it started with Lara posing a question to a candidate and giving him 2 minutes to respond. And then for the next 13 minutes, the idea was there would be back and forth between the 2 candidates, and then they could pose follow-up questions to some of the comments that were made. Our unit of analysis was taken from Krippendorf's work on content analysis. We defined it as a propositional unit that took into account words, sets of words, phrases, sentences, and sets of sentences. Now, the difficult thing about this is because values are oftentimes implied okay, or latent. They're not always obvious. So we developed a set of criteria to help us identify what some of these value premises were, and I'll just basically summarize this for you. One is we looked at things that would express or implicitly reference some kind of a value pattern or a value orientation. We also took into account positive or negative statements that seem to invoke a value structure. Specific references to concrete values, okay, images such as the U.S. Constitution, okay, or the United States flag. The omission of certain types of value claims and appeals. And the employment of narratives or metaphors or testimony that would espouse some kind of mainstream ideology or value pattern. We inductively, qualitatively coded for this. We took the transcript off the Commission of Presidential Debate website. It was about a 49-page transcript. We looked over Steele and Redding's original model, and if you'll take a look at the handout that I provided you, we list out for you all of the different value orientations that they cite in their work. And then we independently studied the transcript and coded for these things, gave it several critical readings, and any discrepancies that we came up with in the final analysis were resolved on a case-by-case basis. Now, so what did we find? Well, if you look at the table that I provided you on the other side, you get some sense of what was going on here. We found that Obama appealed most heavily to efficiency, practicality, and pragmatism. I'll give you some context for this in a second. Generosity, equality of opportunity, effort and optimism, and material comfort. Romney sought to identify himself with a rejection of authority, efficiency, practicality, and pragmatism, material comfort, and patriotism. Obama used a total of 7 different value appeals in this debate, and Romney used about 9. Now, just to give you some context for this, some holistic context, if you look at the value appeals that Obama employed in this debate, and this is oftentimes the case with an incumbent, they have to come forth and they have to say, things are getting better. Okay, we have hope. You know, we've done a lot of work so far. Things are getting better. You've got to give us more time. Okay. And that was essentially what he tried to argue throughout the debate. So we talked about the hardworking middle class, that we've come in, we've tried to do things to support them. We've implemented a number of policies that are slowly taking effect. The economy is growing. It's not growing fast enough, but it's starting to grow, and we need to stay the course. So in looking at some of these values, he talked a lot about how his administration had made government more practical and efficient. And he made numerous references to this over and over and over again, particularly when it came to health care. Okay. In terms of being generous and considerate to others, he talked a lot, very openly, about the middle class and the things that his administration had done to support the middle class. In other words, we need to be caring and considerate of people, and we need to respond to what they're going through. Effort and optimism. He talked a lot about the effort and the optimistic nature of the American people, and how he thought that that was a strength, not a weakness, and that was something that we needed to build off of. And material comfort. In discussions of the economy, he talked a lot about what people were making, what they were able to afford. He talked about education and trying to provide opportunities for the middle class to go to college and pay for it. For Romney, rejection of authority became a staple of his approach. And most of these arguments came on the segment on health care. And if you'll look at the total, almost 44% of Romney's value appeals pertain to a rejection of authority. And it went sort of like this. Government's too big, it's too large, it's too vast. Government's inefficient. Obama's all about big government. So we have to oppose it. We have to try something else. Of course, he would try to make the arguments that many of the problems that we were going through now were being worsened by government action. And so if we could downsize government, it would actually, bring back the economy. The middle class would start to prosper,